And here is Cynthia Hursh, President of the Andros branch of the Bahamas Historical Society.
The Andros branch of the Bahamas Historical Society started in 1990 in December. We formed a branch of the Bahamas Historical Society for the people living on Andros who are interested in history. And this group ranges from South Andros up to Nichols Town. We have developed several different project areas. One group is doing an oral history project who record the older people on the island. We have audio and video that we're cataloging and making available for people who are studying in these different areas. The museum project is one of our more exciting areas, and we hope in 1992 to actually have a display open for the public. Our primary concern are the school children and the residents of the island, so that they'll be able to see the different artifacts that we've obtained from different excavations and field work. And then, of course, the third group are the field studies unit. And this group of people work in all kinds of weather and all kinds of conditions up and down through the island, locating different historic sites. We do the field site first. We record everything possible so that the Department of Archives can send over their archaeologist, Tony Ahrens, and actually conduct test pit excavations or full-scale excavations. Our team then adds support to the excavations and is able to learn a lot about the island. After that, the artifacts are cataloged, inventoried, and stored so that we'll be able to use them for a museum display. Who lived on Andros when Columbus arrived in the Bahamas were a gentle farming and fishing culture. They were systematically removed from the islands for slave labor down in Trinidad and the pearl fisheries and down in Cuba for the gold mines. What's left today is all that we can find out about them. All of the artifacts that we find reveal more and more each time. The old conch that we find on the beach, the incised holes, talk about the different tools that they use. The conch were used as tools, as jewelry, and as a food source. Down here, there's a few illustrations of how some of them were used as hammers, as tools, to carve the dugout canoes that they used. The waterways were the roads then, as they were up until the 1960s on Andros. Most of the settlement areas that you'll find are all right around the water cuts. So we can find areas that people live in today that were also Lucayan sites at the time. Some of the different pottery shards that we found in different areas of Andros show that there was quite a bit of trade going on. The Lucayans were very mobile in these canoes that they constructed. The import ware that you're seeing right now is actually made in the areas that had the igneous rock. The clay and shell fragments are mixed with a much tougher rock base. These pieces were generally decorated. You can see, if you look very carefully, that they have some incised designs and single and double annular rings around the rims. The palmetto ware was often decorated, and these were made in the Bahamas. Over on this side right there. Often pieces would be cut with designs. Pieces of clay would be added in blobs and decorations. The palmetto ware was made out of the red loam soil of the Bahamas, and these often had to be much thicker than the import ware because the soil wasn't as strong and the rock base was not as hard. Palmetto ware has been found from North Andros to South Andros, which gives us an idea of some of the areas where the Lucayans lived when they were on the island. Bahama Islands, the duhos have been found, and these are ceremonial stools that would be used by the chiefs or caciques. These are also found in the caves, the banana holes, and the middens, and so often they're very well preserved. The stools would sit low to the ground and would have a zoomorphic head, often representing some sort of animal life that you would find in the Bahamas. So these have been found with bats' heads, turtle heads, iguana heads, and they're very interesting. This is a replica that's been done by Terry Cornell to kind of illustrate some of the things that we've been looking for. One of the problems with the pieces on Andros is that people are not aware what they are, for one thing, so the pieces are lost. And the other is that the value of them historically hasn't been taught. These pieces have never been displayed before, and so most of the artifacts that we do display for the first time, people will recognize and say, oh, my grandmother found one of those, or I've seen one of those. And so we hope by forming a museum that they'll be able to learn more about their own heritage and be able to share what they've known from past years that has existed. One of the great heartaches is that a canoe and paddles was found on Mangrove Key in a cave back in the late 1800s. And by the time any archaeologist was able to come and identify it, it was 30, 40 years later, and it no longer existed. So it wasn't able to be verified or disputed, but it would be interesting. When we were down doing some field work, we involve as many people as possible in all the different areas when we go. We try to introduce ourselves at the schools, to any of the older people in the communities who may be aware of historic sites or older areas. This is a fellow named Alfred Johnson. Alfred was an excellent guide to some of the historic areas. While we were discussing the Lucayan Teano Indians of the island and how they existed on Andros, some of the possible artifacts he may have seen before, he told us that he already had in his home one or two of these pedaloid celts. Now this celt is made of a serpentine stone. It's igneous in origin, and we have no igneous rocks on the island. So this was brought up from the Greater or Lesser Antilles at some point. These celts originally were in the shape of an axe head, or used for that. By the time they came into the Bahamas, they were probably religious relics or trade ware used as a form of money. These celts are often found in the banana holes or the middens of the island and brought out as the local people go for cave earth. A lot of the soil will collect in these holes, bat droppings and such, and these will be spread out in the fields to fertilize the cornfields or the areas where they're planting. The celt then is found out in the cornfields. The local name for these is thunderbolts, because they believe nowadays that the lightning will strike the ground and that this is the tip of the lightning. This is kind of evolved into a nice little relic. These are found all over the islands, and they are from the Lucayan Teano origin. So most of these are over 1,000 years old. Italians were the only ones who had to hide from the Spanish on the island. The pirates and wreckers also found Andros to be fairly fascinating. The little nooks and crannies, the bights in the islands, made it possible for them to hide from some of the larger ships. Often the pirates would go into Nassau and unload their holds and sell their goods and party, and then come back to Andros to replenish their supplies of fruits and vegetables and work on repairing the boats, anything necessary. Often they'd keep women on the island in a fortress of some sort. Down at the barracks in Long Bay Cays. Long Bay Cays on South Andros is one of the choicest pieces of property on the island. Long Bay Cays is one of the only natural breaks in the reef where large boats could enter and leave. The barracks is an old fort that was constructed up on the top of a hill and overlooks this Long Bay Cays entrance. To the water at Long Bay Cays is an inscription in one of the rocks that was mentioned back in the 1800s by the commissioner of the island, Lennox Forsyth. This inscription we found this year when we were down doing field studies, and it says BB 1746. Unfortunately, this area of rock has just been run over with a grader because of the soil right next to it where planting has been done. I'm not sure how much longer this inscription is going to last, but it's now called Money Rock because a crevice that sits adjacent to it held some gold back in the 1960s. But Building Hill, on a sideways glance from these cuts in the rock, is the fort, or the barracks as they're now called. This area is one of the highest points on the island, approximately 80 feet in height. Undergrowth and the overgrowth up on the hill, you start to be able to see the remains of the old fort. These areas would have supported timbers which would have risen to a second or possibly third story for better view. This area would probably have been a good lookout area. Inside the foundation, several rocks have cuttings. One has a large R that sit over top of holes where again gold was supposedly found. The factors about the barracks is the fact that the front walls are over 3 feet thick. This is something that's totally foreign to Andros. Most of the walls on any of the lime houses are approximately 12 inches thick. This shows that they had some reason for having to fortify. Also in these areas, some of the local people have found old wooden crosses and graves, as well as what they believe to be gun emplacements with rounded cuts in rocks. Also of the barracks, the main housing area. And this is interesting because we found a line that ran about approximately 7 feet from the top to the bottom and extended out past it into a cook area. This was one of the areas with the marked rocks where gold was supposedly found in the 60s. The Barton Plantation down north of Mars Bay on South Andros was one of the Loyalist plantations. The Loyalists came from the island of San Andreas and also from America right after the Revolutionary War, and they brought with them their goods, their slaves, and their way of living. This piece of property was one of the most expansive that was awarded at the time. It's over 50 acres, and the hand-built rock walls stand over 6 feet high. The Barton Plantation was originally used for cattle, and later they turned to timbering when the plantation started to fall. William Barton came to Andros from America in 1783, and he brought with him his family and his slaves. Many of the pieces that we found, the artifacts from around the area, included some pieces of Delft, which showed that he was a very wealthy man. We also have pieces of earthenware, clay pipes, glass, that all help us give a date to how long this site was used. The hurricanes and drought of the time, as well as a cotton blight, which took out most of the cotton at the time, threw these plantations into more poverty than they had been used to in America. Also, the emancipation of slaves in 1834 took away the style of living that they were used to at the time. Often these people returned to England or to the States, and their slaves were freed. It held some other pieces when it was being used, but on the Barton Plantation, like many other sites, they created their own mortar by crushing the limestone, burning the conch, and then grating it, adding it with water and some other liquids to create a mortar which is held. This lime mortar is actually almost the same color of the stones, which shows part of the aging process which has gone on. Pipes, the white kaolin type, are used even somewhat up until modern times, but the different boreholes help us to date them. These artifacts help us verify the site, how long it was used, who lived there, and teach us a little bit about their lifestyle during this time on the island. The Barton Plantation was lived in approximately until 1860, and now it sits abandoned. Storage vessel which was found at the Barton Plantation along with several other pieces that all fit together. This is dated approximately 1775 to 1800, and they probably brought it with them when they came. Hurricanes in the early 1920s, 1926 and 1929, left the island in a totally new light. The food sources were gone, the fruit trees were wiped clean, and many new food sources were found. These pieces, which were probably from around the 1940s, came over with some of the Haitians who migrated here around that time. Mars Bay is settled now by a large number of people who are descended from some of the Haitian culture. They bring with them some of their own religion, some of their own artwork, and a new way of looking at things. In the 1940s, a man named Paul Zoll came to Andros and started doing a flamingo study. He had noted at that time that the flamingo numbers were gradually becoming lesser and lesser. This was largely in part to the fact that hurricanes had destroyed successive hatchings of eggs, There was also a direct occurrence to the air flights that were taking place right over the nesting grounds. The RAF at that time was sending their World War II pilots over to Nassau, and they were training by flying right over flamingo sites, making these flamingos take flight and trample their eggs, and that season would be gone. There was also an oil drilling company that was right nearby that would fly directly over these nesting sites. And after several years, this led to the population. Nesting grounds are basically left barren after several years. The young birds that would have bred became fewer and fewer. The other thing that happened was that the hurricanes had left the people very hungry. Iguanas became prime food sources, and so did flamingo eggs and the young flamingos. Flamingos are a flocking type of bird that group their young. The young ones will stay together in little groups. The flightless young, under a year old, will stay together also, and these left them ready to be cook sources. A mangrove area where they couldn't get away, and they would just take each one by one, snap their necks and throw them in a pile. And this would be as a food source. This wasn't something that was frivolous. It was for very hungry people who had lost their root crops, who had lost the fruit, who had lost most of their livestock to the hurricanes year after year. But again, the flamingos became almost non-existent on Andros. By 1942, the second study that was done turned out that no flamingos could be found in the old nesting sites. For many years it was believed that the flamingos had left Andros because none had been seen. Then again, in the late 1980s, the flamingos started to return to Andros and are returning to some very remote areas. We're hoping that if they're left alone, they'll be able to start replenishing again. So time will tell. Andros is one of the more secluded islands where things like this are possible.
Works of art, like the Junkanoo doll that's made out of all native materials, help to illustrate some of the past from the island. This Junkanoo doll represents the Junkanoo Festival, which began back in African days. It was brought to the island by the slaves and Africans who settled here. This doll was done by Vaughn Coakley, an 18-year-old from Calabash Bay, to help us to illustrate some of the history of the island. Basically, the Andros branch of the Bahamas Historical Society is just trying to gather and collect all of the information possible on the history of Andros so that these young people can learn from the older people and from the things that exist from the past.